The sun hung low over the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting long golden streaks across the manicured lawns and perfectly symmetrical flower beds. To an outsider, it looked like a slice of paradise, a picturesque community where every house seemed pulled from a magazine cover. But for those who lived there, the truth was far more complicated. When Thomas and his wife, Eleanor, moved into their new home, they believed they were stepping into a peaceful retirement, a well-earned reward for decades of hard work. Thomas, a retired federal investigator, had always dreamed of a serene life where he could tend to his garden and enjoy the company of his grandchildren during their weekend visits. The welcome they received from the Homeowners Association, the HOA, seemed warm enough at first. Linda Prescott, the HOA president, arrived at their doorstep within hours of their moving truck pulling away, a wide smile plastered on her face, her perfectly ironed blazer practically screaming authority. She handed them a glossy packet of community guidelines, her voice sweet but firm as she emphasized how the neighborhood thrived on structure and order. Thomas listened politely, nodding in all the right places, but even then, a small part of him noticed something, a flicker in her smile, a tightness around her eyes. It was the kind of expression he'd seen countless times in his career, the look of someone who enjoyed having power over others. Still, he brushed it off. It was just a neighborhood association after all. How bad could it be? It didn't take long for the first cracks to show. The notices started appearing just a few weeks after they settled in. Small, seemingly harmless pieces of paper tucked neatly into their mailbox. The first one stated that the petunias Eleanor had planted in their front yard were not in compliance with the HOA's approved color palette. Confused, Thomas reread the guidelines but found no mention of restricted flower colors. He mentioned it to Eleanor, and they both chuckled, thinking it had to be some kind of mistake. The next notice wasn't as light-hearted, a warning about their porch decorations. Apparently, the seasonal wreath Eleanor had hung on their door was too large and disruptive to the community's visual harmony. The language in the letter was so formal, so exaggerated, that it almost seemed like a joke. But the fine at the bottom of the page, a $75 penalty, was very real. Thomas couldn't understand it. The wreath wasn't garish or oversized. It was a simple, tasteful arrangement of autumn leaves. He began to wonder if this was more than just overzealous rule enforcement. Was it something personal? He decided to pay Linda a visit and politely question the notices, but her response was anything but understanding. She smiled, the same too-perfect smile from the day they met, and told him the board's decisions were final. "Rules are rules, Mr. Caldwell," she said with a syrupy tone. "It's what keeps this community beautiful." Thomas left that meeting with a sinking feeling in his gut. This wasn't about keeping the neighborhood beautiful. It was about control. As the weeks wore on, Thomas began to notice a strange pattern in the neighborhood, a silence that wasn't natural. The neighbors would wave politely, exchange short greetings, but there was a hesitation in their smiles, a certain guardedness in their voices. It was as if an invisible weight hung over everyone, a collective fear no one dared speak about. The more Thomas observed, the more he realized the truth. The HOA, specifically Linda, ruled the community with an iron fist. Homeowners weren't just following rules, they were terrified of breaking them. Conversations at the community clubhouse were always hushed, with neighbors nervously glancing over their shoulders whenever the topic of the HOA came up. Thomas learned that several residents had been publicly humiliated by Linda, their violations posted on the HOA's website for all to see. People who had dared to question the board's decisions often found themselves hit with a sudden flurry of new fines, like a punishment for daring to speak up. An elderly couple down the street had been fined $200 for having a garden gnome deemed aesthetic clutter. Another family was forced to repaint their shutters twice in 1 month because the shade of blue wasn't consistent with community standards. Thomas wasn't just angry, he was heartbroken. These weren't just rules. They were weapons wielded by Linda to keep everyone in line. Then came the ultimate humiliation. One afternoon, Thomas stepped outside to find a bold red notice pinned to the community bulletin board. His name, in glaring capital letters, listed under the current violators section. The notice claimed his lawn ornaments were excessive and detracting from neighborhood value. The only lawn ornaments Thomas had were a small bird feeder Eleanor loved and a single stone statue of a rabbit near their garden. But the damage was done. His neighbors now saw him as a rule breaker. He noticed how they started avoiding eye contact, their conversations growing even shorter. Linda's tactic was clear: isolate the troublemakers by turning the rest of the community against them. Thomas felt a deep sting of shame, not for breaking a rule, but for being made to feel like a criminal in his own home. Eleanor, ever the optimist, told him to brush it off, but Thomas couldn't. It wasn't about a bird feeder or a rabbit statue. It was about dignity. He had spent his life serving his country, upholding justice, and now here he was being publicly shamed over nonsense. The emotional weight of it all gnawed at him, not just the humiliation, but the helplessness of watching his neighbors live in fear, too scared to speak out. The moment things truly spiraled was the day the so-called community security officers showed up at Thomas's door. Two men dressed in what appeared to be official uniforms knocked loudly, too loudly, and announced they were there to discuss ongoing violations and consequences. Thomas answered calmly, his instincts already on high alert. The men's uniforms looked professional at first glance, but there was something off. No official badges, no name tags, and the way they spoke sounded rehearsed. They handed Thomas a notice claiming he was now in serious breach of community guidelines, accusing him of running an unauthorized business out of his home, all because Eleanor sold a few homemade crafts online. What's worse, they threatened further fines, even mentioning the possibility of legal action and forced eviction. Thomas studied their faces carefully, suppressing the anger boiling inside him. These weren't real officers. They were muscle for Linda's operation, hired to intimidate and control. But Thomas didn't flinch. Instead, he quietly took the notice, thanked the men, and shut the door. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the realization that this had gone too far. This wasn't just about an overzealous HOA anymore. This was about abuse of power. And what Linda didn't know, what those fake officers didn't realize, was that they hadn't just threatened another scared homeowner. They had just declared war on a man who had spent his entire career fighting fraud and corruption. Thomas sat in his study that night, the violation notice still clutched in his hand, but his mind was miles away, not in his quiet suburban home, but back in his days as a federal investigator. He remembered the countless fraud cases he had worked on, the con artists who spoke with false authority, the criminals who hid behind official-looking paperwork to manipulate others. It was all the same game, just a new setting. Linda wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was running a small-scale operation built on fear and deception. The so-called security officers had been nothing more than hired muscle, and Thomas was willing to bet they had no legal authority whatsoever. But what bothered him most wasn't just the corruption. It was how deeply the fear had rooted itself in the community. His neighbors weren't just following the rules. They were terrified of breaking them. They whispered instead of speaking, looked over their shoulders as if Linda were always watching. This wasn't about keeping a neighborhood beautiful. This was about control. And Thomas knew that fear only worked when people believed they were alone. But he wasn't alone. Not anymore. It was time to start fighting back, quietly, strategically, the way he had done for years in his career. Linda had played her hand, thinking Thomas was just another retiree she could bully. But she had made a grave mistake. She didn't realize that Thomas knew the law, and soon the entire community would too. The next morning, Thomas didn't go straight to Linda's house, nor did he send angry emails like most would have done. He played it smart the way he always did. He started gathering evidence. Every notice he'd received from the HOA, every fine, every accusation, was meticulously organized into a file. He reread the community guidelines and cross-referenced them with county laws, searching for contradictions, and he found plenty. But he didn't stop there. Thomas began reaching out to his neighbors, not in a loud, rebellious way, but through quiet, one-on-one conversations. He started with the elderly couple who had been fined for their garden gnome. "Just curious," Thomas asked casually over their white picket fence. "Did Linda ever explain which exact rule you broke?" The couple exchanged nervous glances. Then, slowly, the husband admitted they never received a clear explanation. They had paid the fine out of fear of further punishment. Thomas nodded, thanked them, and moved on, each conversation revealing a pattern of vague rules, unjustified penalties, and Linda's iron grip over the board. But there was something else, something even more disturbing. Several neighbors mentioned that their fines hadn't been processed through official HOA channels. Instead, Linda had requested personal checks made out directly to her or one of her board members. That was it, the crack Thomas had been waiting for. It wasn't just abuse of power anymore. This was financial fraud. And now he had the evidence to prove it. As Thomas quietly gathered his case, something else began to happen. The community, once paralyzed by fear, started to awaken. It started small, whispered conversations on driveways, longer than usual chats at the mailbox. Neighbors who once darted inside at the sight of Linda's clipboard now lingered, asking subtle questions about their rights. Thomas noticed the shift. Fear was being replaced by curiosity, then by anger. People weren't just frustrated about the fines or the absurd rules. They were furious at how powerless they had been made to feel. One evening, Thomas invited a few trusted neighbors over under the guise of a casual dinner. It wasn't casual at all. He laid out the file he had been compiling: the bogus fines, the discrepancies in the HOA's accounts, and the fake security officers. The room fell silent as the truth settled in. Linda wasn't just an overzealous leader. She was a fraud, using her position to line her pockets while keeping everyone too scared to question her. The neighbors, once so used to submission, began sharing their own horror stories. The single mother threatened with eviction over a crooked mailbox, the couple forced to repaint their shutters twice just to satisfy Linda's arbitrary taste. And with every story shared, the fear cracked a little more. They weren't alone. Linda had isolated them. But now, thanks to Thomas, they were finding their voice again. But Thomas wasn't done. While the community's anger grew, he kept his final weapon hidden: the sting operation. With his background in law enforcement, Thomas knew that accusations alone wouldn't be enough. He needed something concrete, undeniable proof that Linda had crossed the line from intimidation into criminal behavior. And then, almost like clockwork, the fake security officers returned. They knocked on Thomas's door again, this time with an even more threatening tone. They demanded immediate payment for his latest violation, an unapproved bird feeder, and warned that if he didn't comply, further action would be taken. But Thomas was ready. What these so-called officers didn't know was that Thomas had contacted real law enforcement ahead of time, briefing them on the situation. As the fake security officers pushed their fabricated legal jargon, 2 uniformed county deputies rounded the corner, and the color drained from the imposters' faces. Within minutes, they were in handcuffs, charged with impersonating law enforcement and attempting to extort money under false pretenses. But the real twist came when one of the officers, panicked and desperate, revealed that Linda herself had hired them, paying them directly from the HOA's so-called enforcement fund. That was the moment Thomas knew. The noose was tightening and Linda's empire was crumbling. The community's simmering frustration finally boiled over at the next HOA meeting. Word had spread fast about the fake security officer's arrest, and for the first time in years, the community clubhouse was packed, not with silent, nervous homeowners, but with angry, determined neighbors ready for answers. Thomas, calm and prepared, brought his file with him, a mountain of evidence, from illegal fines to financial discrepancies, and of course the damning confession about Linda's hired muscle. When Linda tried to start the meeting with her usual polished smile and condescending tone, Thomas didn't wait for her to finish. "Before we discuss lawn colors and curtain regulations," he said, his voice steady but firm, "I think the community deserves to know how the HOA's funds have really been used." Gasps rippled through the crowd as Thomas laid out the evidence: the unapproved personal checks, the illegal road extensions, the fake security team paid directly from community funds. Linda's smile vanished. replaced by a flicker of panic. "These are outrageous accusations," she sputtered, but her voice cracked with fear. "You're twisting things, Thomas." But it was too late. The room was no longer hers to control. Neighbors stood up one by one, demanding transparency, shouting questions, and calling for Linda's immediate resignation. The very people she had ruled through fear were now fearless, and it was all because Thomas had shown them the truth. The air in the community clubhouse felt thick, a strange mix of tension, fear, and something new, something dangerous. It wasn't the usual, oppressive silence Linda Prescott was used to commanding. No, this was different. The homeowners, once so timid, so careful with their words, were now staring her down, their hushed whispers growing louder with every passing second. Thomas stood calmly near the front of the room, his folder of evidence open like a loaded weapon on the table beside him. He didn't need to raise his voice or bang his fist on the table. The facts spoke louder than any threat ever could. One by one, the neighbors who had once cowered under Linda's rule began to stand, asking pointed questions, demanding answers. An elderly man, his voice shaking with both age and fury, held up a violation notice he'd received for having a non-HOA-approved American flag on his porch. "Linda," he said, his voice cracking, "was this fine about community standards, or was it about your power?" A woman in the back, a single mother who had once been threatened with eviction over a crooked mailbox, spoke up next. "You tried to make me feel small," she said, her voice trembling, "but I'm not scared of you anymore." Thomas watched as the wave of resistance spread like wildfire through the room. The community had finally woken up, and Linda's reign of fear was collapsing right before her eyes. Linda's face was a mask of barely concealed panic. She tried to speak, to regain control, but her voice faltered. "This is a misunderstanding," she stammered, her polished confidence slipping. "Everything I've done has been for the good of the community." But the words felt hollow now, empty, like a crumbling facade that could no longer hide the truth beneath. Thomas didn't give her time to spin her lies. He stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "For the good of the community," he repeated softly, his words slicing through the room like a knife. "Then explain why you hired unlicensed security officers to intimidate your own neighbors. Explain why you accepted personal checks for bogus fines. Checks made out to you, not the HOA." Gasps echoed through the crowd as Thomas produced the evidence. Photocopies of the checks, each one signed over to Linda or her closest allies on the board. "Explain," Thomas continued, his voice now a low, steady growl, "why you funneled HOA funds into a private account under the guise of enforcement fees, all while threatening innocent people with fake legal action." Linda's composure shattered. "You don't understand," she hissed, her face pale. "I was trying to keep order." But no one was listening anymore. The spell had broken. Her power wasn't real, it had always been built on fear and deception, and now everyone saw her for what she truly was. The final blow came when the doors to the clubhouse swung open, and two uniformed county deputies stepped inside. The room fell into stunned silence. Linda's mouth opened and closed, her once powerful voice reduced to a faint whisper. What is this?" she choked out. Thomas didn't move. He simply nodded to the officers. "This," he said, his voice like thunder, "is justice." The deputies calmly informed Linda that an official investigation had uncovered enough evidence to press charges: fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to extort. The fake security officers had turned on her, revealing everything in exchange for leniency. How Linda had orchestrated the threats, manipulated HOA funds, and weaponized fines for her own gain. Her hands trembled as the deputies approached, their handcuffs gleaming in the harsh fluorescent light. "You can't do this," Linda gasped, her voice cracking. "I'm the HOA president." But the title that once made her untouchable now meant nothing. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Linda's reign of fear came to a humiliating end, not with a roar, but with a whimper. The clubhouse erupted, not in chaos but in quiet, stunned relief. The neighbors, people who had once lived in fear of Linda's clipboard and endless violations, now stood united. Some were whispering in disbelief, others hugging each other, finally free from years of silent oppression. And then it happened. A slow, hesitant clap echoed through the room. It was Jenkins, the retired veteran who had been fined for a garden gnome. "About time," he muttered, his voice breaking the silence. Another clap followed, then another, until the entire room erupted into applause. It wasn't the loud, celebratory kind. It was the exhausted, emotional kind, the sound of people finally breathing free. Thomas didn't join in. He simply stood there, watching the community reclaim their voice. This wasn't about revenge. Not really. It was about justice. It was about showing every person in that room that fear only wins when good people stay silent. And tonight no one was silent. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood transformed. Linda and the corrupt board members had been stripped of their positions and their control. A new HOA was elected, one led by homeowners who believed in fairness and transparency. Thomas, despite his protests, was voted onto the new board, not because he wanted power, but because his neighbors trusted him to protect their community from ever falling back into Linda's trap. The once quiet streets now buzzed with life, neighbors chatting freely, children playing without the looming threat of violations. People who once avoided eye contact at the mailbox now stopped to talk, to laugh, to connect. The fear was gone, replaced by something far more powerful: unity. Thomas spent his mornings drinking coffee on his porch, the same bird feeder Linda once tried to ban still swaying in the breeze. A small, silent victory against the tyranny that once ruled their lives. But the most satisfying moment came a month later. Thomas was out trimming his hedges when he noticed the "for sale" sign on Linda's lawn. Her once pristine home, the fortress from which she had ruled the community, now stood empty, a symbol of her downfall. She had left, unable to bear living in the very neighborhood she had tried to control. Thomas didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply tipped his hat to the empty house, a silent goodbye to the woman who thought fear was stronger than justice. It wasn't. Justice had won. And as Thomas watched his neighbors gather down the street, no longer whispering, no longer afraid, he realized the true victory wasn't just Linda's arrest. It was the community finding its voice again. The greatest revenge wasn't in watching Linda fall. It was in watching his neighbors rise.